In the abandoned ruins of what was once a thriving neighborhood, among the crumbling concrete and twisted metal, lived a ghost that the world had forgotten. Viktor Petrov had been declared dead 3 times by 3 different armies, yet he continued to breathe, to watch, and to remember. For 7 years he had called these ruins home, surviving on rainwater, rats, and the occasional care package dropped by rebels who thought they were feeding a legend. The world knew stories of snipers who could hit targets from impossible distances, of soldiers who fought with honor, and of warriors who died gloriously in battle. But nobody tells the story of the sniper who simply refused to die, who watched his entire brotherhood fall one by one, and who now sits in the shadows of a city that no longer remembers his name. Viktor's story isn't about heroism or glory. It's about what happens when the war ends, the cameras leave, and the world moves on, but one man remains, carrying the weight of every shot he never took and every life he couldn't save. This is the story of a man who became a myth in his own lifetime, not because of what he did, but because of what he survived. In the distance, sirens wail through the empty streets, just as they have every night for the past 7 years. But tonight is different. Tonight, someone is coming for Viktor. And this time, he might not have anywhere left to hide. Viktor Petrov adjusted his position on the concrete ledge for the 1,000th time that month, his weathered hands gripping a rifle that had become more familiar to him than his own reflection. The scope showed him the same view it had for 7 years: empty streets, crumbling buildings, and the occasional stray dog picking through garbage. But today, something was different. Today, there was movement in the building across the plaza, movement that didn't belong to the usual scavengers and homeless wanderers who called these ruins home. He had been the best sniper in the Red Star Brotherhood, a group of elite marksmen who had fought together through 3 different conflicts across Eastern Europe. They called themselves brothers not because of blood, but because they shared something deeper than family ties. They shared the weight of taking lives from a distance, the burden of watching through a scope as their bullets found their marks, and the strange comfort of knowing that someone else understood what it meant to kill without ever seeing the fear in your victim's eyes. The Brotherhood had started with 12 men. Viktor was now the only one left alive, though officially he had been dead for 7 years. His story began in Moldavia, where he had been born to a family of farmers who barely scraped by on potatoes and hope. Viktor discovered his gift with a rifle when he was 15, hunting rabbits to supplement the family's meager meals. His father had been amazed at how the quiet boy could hit targets that seemed impossible, how he could remain perfectly still for hours, and how he never seemed to miss. When the military recruiters came through their village, Viktor's father practically pushed him toward them, knowing that his son's talent could provide opportunities that farming never would. The military training came naturally to Viktor. While other recruits struggled with discipline and precision, he thrived in the structured environment. His instructors quickly recognized his exceptional marksmanship skills and recommended him for sniper training. It was during this advanced training that he met the men who would become his brothers. Marcus was from Romania, a former Olympic shooter who had joined the military after his country's economic collapse made competitive shooting a luxury he couldn't afford. Dmitry came from the mountains of Georgia, where he had learned to shoot by hunting wolves that threatened his family's livestock. Ahmed was a Bosnian refugee whose family had been killed in the ethnic conflicts of the 1990s and who saw military service as his path to justice. There were others too, each with their own story of how life had led them to look through a rifle scope and make decisions that would haunt them forever. They bonded during the brutal sniper training program, which pushed them beyond physical and mental limits. They learned to calculate wind speed, humidity, and distance in seconds. They practiced shooting from impossible positions, in extreme weather conditions, and under the kind of psychological pressure that broke lesser men. Most importantly, they learned to trust each other completely, because in their line of work, your spotter might be the only thing standing between you and death. The Brotherhood's first deployment was in a peacekeeping mission that quickly turned into something much more dangerous. They found themselves in the middle of a civil war where the lines between good guys and bad guys blurred until they disappeared entirely. Their commanding officers gave them targets and coordinates, but as the months passed, Viktor and his brothers began to realize that they were not always fighting for the right side. It was Marcus who first voiced what they were all thinking. During a particularly cold night while they waited for extraction after a successful mission, he asked the question that would change everything. What if we're the bad guys? The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, and continued in whispers and coded messages for weeks afterward. They realized that their skills made them valuable to anyone willing to pay, and that their current employers were using them to eliminate political opponents rather than genuine military targets. The revelation should have torn them apart, but instead, it brought them closer together. They made the decision to leave their military unit together, taking their skills and their brotherhood with them. It wasn't desertion, exactly, because they completed their contracts and left when their service terms expired. But it also wasn't entirely legal, because they took their military-issued equipment and disappeared into the gray world of freelance military contractors and private security companies. For 3 years, the Brotherhood worked together, taking contracts that they could live with and turning down jobs that crossed their moral lines. They specialized in protecting aid workers in dangerous regions, eliminating drug cartel leaders who were terrorizing civilian populations, and providing security for journalists covering conflicts in remote areas. The money was good, but more importantly, they felt like they were finally using their deadly skills for purposes they could justify. Victor's specialty was long-range elimination shots, the kind that required him to remain hidden for days or even weeks while waiting for the perfect moment. He could hit a target from over a mile away, adjusting for wind, weather, and the Earth's rotation. His brothers called him the Ghost because he could disappear into any environment and emerge days later having completed his mission without anyone ever knowing he had been there. The job that would ultimately destroy the Brotherhood came from an unexpected source. A United Nations official who claimed to need their help stopping a genocide in a small Eastern European country. The official, a well-dressed man named Morrison, who spoke with a British accent and carried credentials that looked legitimate, offered them more money than they had ever seen for what seemed like a righteous cause. Morrison told them that a local warlord named Kozlov was planning to massacre an entire ethnic minority population in a remote mountain region. The international community couldn't intervene officially because of political complications, but Morrison claimed he had authority to hire the Brotherhood to eliminate Kozlov and his key lieutenants before the massacre could take place. The story made sense, and Morrison provided them with detailed intelligence, satellite photos, and what appeared to be legitimate documentation of Kozlov's planned atrocities. Most convincingly, he showed them videos of previous massacres that Kozlov had allegedly committed, footage that was so disturbing that even hardened soldiers like Victor and his brothers felt sickened. They took the job believing they were preventing a genocide. Victor spent 2 weeks in position, watching Kozlov's compound through his scope, learning the routines of the guards, and waiting for the perfect shot. His brothers were positioned at strategic points around the compound, ready to eliminate Kozlov's lieutenants simultaneously to prevent any of them from escaping to continue their leader's work. On the designated day, Victor had Kozlov perfectly centered in his crosshairs. The man was sitting on a balcony drinking coffee and reading a newspaper, completely unaware that his life was about to end. Victor controlled his breathing, calculated the wind conditions, and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect. Kozlov's head snapped back, and he slumped forward onto the table. Simultaneously, Victor heard the distant sounds of his brothers' rifles as they eliminated their assigned targets. The mission was completed in less than 30 seconds, just as they had planned. But something was wrong. Instead of fleeing or panicking, Kozlov's guards seemed to have been expecting the attack. They immediately took defensive positions and began returning fire with a level of organization and preparation that suggested they had known exactly what was coming. More troubling, they seemed to know exactly where each of the Brotherhood members was positioned. Victor watched through his scope as military vehicles that definitely didn't belong to Kozlov's ragtag militia surrounded his brothers' positions. These were professional soldiers with modern equipment and tactical training, and they moved with the precision of a carefully planned operation. One by one, Victor watched his brothers die. Marcus was the first to fall, caught in crossfire as he tried to retreat from his position. Dmitri lasted longer, managing to eliminate several of the attacking soldiers before a sniper shot from an unexpected angle ended his life. Ahmed fought the longest, using his knowledge of urban warfare to move through the compound and continue fighting, but eventually, he too was overwhelmed. Victor remained hidden in his position for 16 hours, watching as teams of soldiers systematically searched the area, recovering the bodies of his brothers and all of their equipment. He realized that they had been set up, that Morrison had used them to assassinate someone, but not for the reasons he had given them. The professional response and the organized cleanup operation made it clear that this had been planned from the beginning. As night fell, Victor finally moved from his position, but instead of retreating to the extraction point where Morrison was supposed to be waiting, he decided to investigate. He needed to understand what had really happened and who had killed his brothers. What he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about the mission. Kozlov hadn't been a genocidal warlord at all. He had been a reform-minded local leader who was working to establish peaceful relationships between different ethnic groups in his region. The evidence of his planned massacres had been fabricated, and the videos Morrison had shown them were from entirely different conflicts in different countries. Morrison had used the Brotherhood to assassinate a man who was standing in the way of a mining operation that would displace thousands of people and destroy their traditional homeland. Kozlov's death would allow corrupt officials to take control of the region and sign contracts with international mining companies. Contracts that would make certain people very wealthy while destroying the environment and the lives of local populations. Victor's brothers had died not because they were heroes preventing a genocide, but because they had been used as tools by the very kind of corrupt system they had tried to escape when they left the military. The weight of this realization nearly broke Victor. He had spent his entire adult life learning to live with the moral burden of killing, justifying it by telling himself that he was serving a greater good. Now he discovered that his greatest triumph, the mission he had been most proud of, had actually been his greatest failure. He made a decision that night that would define the rest of his life. Instead of trying to escape the country and disappear like any sensible person would do, Victor decided to stay. He would remain in the ruins of the compound where his brothers had died, and he would watch. He would witness what happened next, document the consequences of their actions, and ensure that the sacrifice of his brothers would not be forgotten, even if the world would never know their names. Victor established himself in the ruins of a bombed-out apartment building that overlooked the compound. He scavenged supplies from the surrounding area, set up a hidden cache of equipment and ammunition, and began his long vigil. He told himself it was temporary, that he would stay just long enough to understand the full scope of what had happened, and then figure out how to get justice for his brothers. 7 years later, he was still there. The mining operation had proceeded exactly as Victor had suspected it would. The local population had been displaced, their homes and traditional lands destroyed by massive excavation equipment. The environmental damage was exactly as devastating as Kozlov had predicted it would be, with streams and rivers contaminated by chemical runoff, and air quality degraded to dangerous levels. Victor documented it all, taking photographs with a long-range camera and keeping detailed written records of everything he observed. He watched as the mining company executives visited the site, as government officials toured the operation, and as journalists were given carefully controlled tours that showed them only what the company wanted them to see. He also watched as the local people, now living in refugee camps and temporary settlements, gradually gave up hope of ever returning to their homeland. He saw children grow up without ever knowing the forests and streams that their parents remembered, and he witnessed the slow death of a culture that had existed in these mountains for thousands of years. But Victor's vigil wasn't just about bearing witness to the consequences of his actions. It was also about ensuring that the truth about his brothers' deaths wouldn't be buried along with their bodies. He knew that Morrison and whoever had hired him would want to erase all evidence of what had really happened, and Victor's continued presence in the area made that impossible. Over the years, several attempts were made to find and eliminate him. Professional assassins, military contractors, and local thugs had all been sent to hunt down the ghost who was supposedly still operating in the region. But Victor's skills hadn't diminished with age, and his knowledge of the local terrain gave him an almost supernatural ability to evade capture. He had become something of a legend among the local population. They called him the Watcher, and left food and supplies in places where they knew he might find them. They told stories about the mysterious figure who lived in the ruins and who seemed to know everything that happened in their region. Some said he was a guardian spirit. Others believed he was a foreign agent. but most simply thought of him as a reminder that someone was still paying attention to their suffering. Victor's existence had become a form of resistance in itself. As long as he remained alive and free, Morrison and his employers couldn't close the book on their operation. They couldn't claim that all loose ends had been tied up, because everyone in the intelligence community knew that one member of the Brotherhood was still out there, still watching, still remembering. The irony wasn't lost on Victor. He had spent most of his life learning to be invisible, to kill without being seen, and to disappear without a trace. Now, his greatest weapon was his visibility, the fact that people knew he was there even if they couldn't find him. As he sat on his concrete ledge, watching the movement in the building across the plaza, Victor wondered if his long vigil was finally coming to an end. The movement was too organized, too professional to be scavengers or curious locals. Someone with serious resources and training was preparing to make another attempt to silence him permanently. Victor smiled grimly as he adjusted his scope and began to calculate distance and wind speed. After 7 years of waiting and watching, he was almost looking forward to the confrontation. He had learned to live with the guilt of his brother's deaths and the consequences of his final mission, but he had never learned to forgive the people who had used them and then discarded them like broken tools. If someone was finally coming to finish what Morrison had started, Victor intended to make sure they understood exactly what they were dealing with. The last member of the Red Star Brotherhood had spent 7 years preparing for this moment, and he had no intention of going quietly into the night. The sun was setting over the ruins, casting long shadows across the empty plaza. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, and the wind carried the scent of rain. Victor settled into his position and began to wait, just as he had been waiting for 7 long years. Tonight, one way or another, his vigil would finally end. The team that came for Victor arrived at dawn, just as he had expected they would. Professional operators always preferred the early morning hours when their targets would be tired, when shadows provided cover, and when the local population would be least likely to witness whatever was about to happen. Victor had been watching them since they entered his territory 3 days earlier, tracking their movements through his network of hidden cameras and motion sensors that he had spent years installing throughout the ruins. There were 6 of them, and Victor recognized the type immediately. They moved with the precise coordination of Special Forces operators, wore unmarked tactical gear that was too expensive for regular military units, and carried weapons that were modified for silent operation. These weren't the local thugs or half-trained mercenaries that had been sent after him in previous years. Someone with serious resources had decided that Viktor Petrov needed to be eliminated professionally and permanently. The team leader was a woman, which surprised Victor. She appeared to be in her 30s, with short blonde hair and the kind of lean, muscular build that came from years of intense physical training. Through his scope, Victor could see that she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never failed a mission, and the way her team members deferred to her suggested that she had earned their respect through proven competence rather than just rank. Victor had given her the codename Valkyrie when he first spotted her team conducting reconnaissance from a building 2 miles away. Like the mythological figures who decided which warriors would die in battle, she had come to make the final decision about Victor's fate. The second team member was a massive man who Victor estimated to be at least 6.5 feet tall and probably weighed close to 300 pounds, all of it muscle. He moved with surprising grace for someone his size, and Victor could see that he was carrying enough ammunition and equipment to supply a small army. This was obviously the team's heavy weapon specialist, and probably their door kicker as well. Victor nicknamed him Thor, and made a mental note that this man would be extremely dangerous in close combat. The third member appeared to be the team's sniper, a thin man with the kind of patient, watchful demeanor that Victor recognized in himself. He carried a rifle case that was longer than standard military issue, suggesting that he was equipped for extremely long-range shots. Most concerning to Victor was the way this man moved through the terrain, carefully checking sight lines and elevation points, as if he were mapping out optimal shooting positions. Victor called him Hawkeye and recognized him as potentially the most dangerous member of the team. The fourth member was clearly their technology specialist. He carried electronic equipment that Victor didn't immediately recognize, including what appeared to be some kind of advanced surveillance gear and possibly signal jamming equipment. This man would be responsible for neutralizing Victor's early warning systems and communication devices, if he had any. Victor dubbed him Oracle, and realized that his carefully constructed network of cameras and sensors might already be compromised. The fifth team member seemed to be their medic and support specialist. She was smaller than the others, but moved with the same professional competence, and Victor could see that her equipment included advanced medical supplies, as well as what appeared to be evidence collection materials. This suggested that the team intended to recover Victor's body, and any intelligence materials he might have gathered during his years in the ruins. Victor named her Athena, and noted that her presence indicated this was meant to be a very thorough operation. The sixth and final member was the most troubling to Victor. This was clearly the team's tracker and wilderness expert, a man who moved through the ruins with an almost supernatural awareness of his environment. Victor watched him examine broken twigs, displaced stones, and other signs that Victor hadn't even realized he was leaving. This man would be able to follow Victor's trail even through terrain where he thought he had been invisible. Victor called him Hunter, and recognized that his usual tactics of evasion and concealment might not be effective against someone with this level of tracking skill. As Victor observed the team's preparation, he realized that someone had done their homework very thoroughly. This wasn't a hasty operation thrown together by bureaucrats who were tired of having loose ends. Someone with access to significant intelligence resources had studied Victor's history, his capabilities, his habits, and his psychology, and had assembled a team specifically designed to counter his advantages. The most troubling realization was that someone had been watching Victor just as carefully as he had been watching everyone else. His daily routines, his preferred observation positions, his cache locations, and probably even his psychological profile were all known to whoever had sent this team. For the first time in 7 years, Victor felt truly vulnerable. But vulnerability wasn't the same thing as helplessness. Victor had spent 7 years not just watching and documenting, but also preparing for exactly this scenario. He had established multiple fallback positions throughout the ruins, each equipped with weapons, supplies, and escape routes. He had memorized every piece of cover, every sightline, and every potential ambush point in a 3-mile radius around his primary position. More importantly, Victor had something that his hunters didn't expect. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. The realization had come to him gradually over the years as he witnessed the consequences of his actions play out in the lives of the displaced local population. Victor had already lost his brothers, his identity, his future, and any hope of redemption. The only thing he had left was his mission to bear witness and ensure that the truth about what had happened here wouldn't be buried along with the people who had suffered because of it. This gave Victor a significant psychological advantage over his hunters. They were professionals doing a job, but Victor was a man fighting for the only thing that gave his life meaning. They had careers and families to return to, but Victor had already accepted that these ruins would probably be his grave. They needed to succeed and survive, but Victor only needed to make sure that his story would outlive him. As the sun rose higher and the team began to move into their final positions, Victor made his own preparations. He gathered the most important documents from his extensive files, including photographs, written records, and copies of the evidence he had collected about Morrison's deception and the Brotherhood's assassination. The container would be buried in a location that only Victor knew, with instructions for its recovery written in a code that only one person in the world would be able to understand. That person was Elena Kozlov, the daughter of the man Victor had killed 7 years earlier. Victor had been watching Elena for years, documenting her efforts to investigate her father's death and expose the truth about the mining operation that had destroyed her homeland. She was a journalist now, working for a small, independent news organization that specialized in exposing corporate corruption and environmental crimes. Victor had never contacted her directly, but he had been quietly providing her with anonymous tips and information that had helped her investigations. Elena didn't know that the man who had killed her father was still alive and living in the ruins of the compound where he had died. But Victor had left her a trail of clues over the years, breadcrumbs that would eventually lead her to the location where he planned to hide the complete truth about what had really happened. If Victor didn't survive the next few hours, Elena would eventually find everything she needed to complete her father's work and expose the people who had used the Brotherhood as unwitting tools of murder. With his contingency plans in place, Victor turned his attention back to the immediate tactical situation. The team had split into 3 pairs and was approaching his position from different angles, just as he had expected they would. Valkyrie and Thor were coming from the main plaza, using the cover of abandoned vehicles and rubble piles to mask their approach. Hawkeye and Oracle were positioning themselves in elevated positions that would give them Overwatch capabilities and electronic warfare support. Athena and Hunter were approaching from the rear, intending to cut off Victor's most likely escape routes. It was a textbook military operation, executed with the kind of precision that Victor recognized from his own days with the Brotherhood. Under normal circumstances, a single target surrounded by 6 professional operators would have no chance of survival. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Victor wasn't a normal target. The first advantage Victor had was intimate knowledge of the terrain. Every pile of rubble, every collapsed wall, every piece of twisted metal in these ruins had been mapped and analyzed during his 7 years of residence. Victor knew which walls would stop bullets and which ones would crumble under pressure. He knew which floors were safe to walk on and which ones would collapse under weight. Most importantly, he knew where every single one of his carefully placed surprises was waiting. Victor had spent years turning the ruins into a defensive fortress, setting up booby traps, false walls, hidden weapons caches, and escape tunnels that would give him significant advantages in a firefight. The team hunting him was expecting to face a lone sniper in a damaged building, but they were actually entering a carefully prepared killing ground, where every advantage belonged to Victor. The second advantage was psychological. The hunting team expected Victor to behave like a normal person who wanted to survive. They expected him to try to escape, to avoid confrontation, and to preserve his own life above all else. But Victor had spent 7 years preparing to die in these ruins, and he had long since made peace with the idea that his vigil would eventually cost him his life. This meant that Victor could take risks and make tactical decisions that would be unthinkable for someone who planned to survive the encounter. He could sacrifice defensive positions to gain offensive opportunities. He could expose himself to enemy fire in order to draw his hunters into disadvantageous positions. Most importantly, he could focus entirely on inflicting maximum damage without worrying about preserving escape routes. The third advantage was motivation. The hunting team was being paid to eliminate Victor, but Victor was fighting to protect the memory of his dead brothers and the truth about what had happened to the displaced local population. Professional soldiers are dangerous, but a man fighting for something he believes in is infinitely more dangerous. As the team moved into their final positions, Victor made his own final preparations. He said a silent goodbye to his brothers, whispered an apology to the family of the man he had killed, and promised Elena Kozlov that she would eventually have the truth she had been seeking for so long. Then Viktor Petrov, the last member of the Red Star Brotherhood, prepared to remind the world why they had called him the Ghost. The first shot came from Hawkeye, aimed at the window where Victor had been positioned for the past hour. It was a perfect shot, placed exactly where Victor's head should have been if he had still been there. But Victor had moved to a different position 20 minutes earlier, using one of his hidden tunnels to relocate without being detected. Instead of hitting Victor, Hawkeye's bullet struck a carefully positioned mirror that Victor had been using to observe the team's approach. The mirror shattered, but not before reflecting a bright flash of sunlight directly into Oracle's electronic equipment, temporarily disabling his surveillance systems and revealing his position to Victor. Victor's return shot came from a position that the team hadn't even known existed, fired through a carefully concealed loophole in a wall that appeared to be solid rubble. The bullet struck Oracle in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his expensive equipment crashing to the ground. The battle for the ruins had begun, and Victor intended to make sure that his hunters understood exactly what they had walked into. As chaos erupted around the compound, with the team scrambling to adjust their tactics to deal with an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time, Victor allowed himself a grim smile. He had spent 7 years waiting for this moment, and now that it had finally arrived, he discovered that he was almost enjoying himself. After all, hunting had always been his specialty. The only difference was that today, he was hunting people who were trying to hunt him. It was going to be an interesting few hours. The battle lasted for 18 hours, and when it was over, the ruins looked like a war zone within a war zone. Smoke rose from burning debris. Walls that had stood for 7 years lay in fresh piles of rubble, and the sound of gunfire had finally given way to an eerie silence that seemed to press down on the compound like a heavy blanket. Victor emerged from his final hiding place as the sun began to set, his clothes torn and bloody, his rifle nearly empty of ammunition, and his body carrying wounds that would have killed a younger man. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was alone among the ruins once again. The hunting team had been everything Victor had expected and more. They had been professional, skilled, and utterly relentless in their pursuit. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated what 7 years of preparation could accomplish when combined with absolute desperation and nothing left to lose. Hawkeye had been the most dangerous, just as Victor had predicted. The enemy sniper had nearly ended Victor's life 3 different times during the battle, missing by inches, when Victor's intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed him to move in ways that his hunter couldn't predict. Their final confrontation had taken place in the ruins of what had once been a school, with both men trying to outmaneuver each other through classrooms where children had once learned to read and write. The duel had ended when Victor used a trick that his brother Marcus had taught him years earlier. Instead of trying to find a better shooting position, Victor had used a series of mirrors to create a false image of himself while shooting from an entirely different location. Hawkeye's bullet had shattered the mirror, but Victor's bullet had found its mark. Oracle had been eliminated earlier in the battle, his shoulder wound preventing him from effectively operating his electronic equipment. Without his technological support, the rest of the team had been forced to rely on more traditional tactics, which played directly into Victor's strengths. A cornered sniper with perfect knowledge of his terrain was more dangerous than any electronic surveillance system. Thor had been the hardest to kill, not because of his skill but because of his sheer physical toughness. Victor had hit him with 3 different shots, any one of which should have been fatal, but the big man had kept coming like some kind of unstoppable force. Their final confrontation had taken place in hand-to-hand combat, when Victor had run out of room to retreat, and Thor had cornered him in what had once been someone's kitchen. Victor had won that fight by using his smaller size and superior knowledge of the building's layout to his advantage, ultimately bringing down a section of damaged ceiling on top of his opponent. But the victory had cost Victor dearly, leaving him with cracked ribs and internal injuries that were slowly sapping his strength. Hunter had been eliminated through cunning, rather than superior firepower. Victor had led the tracker through a carefully planned route that took him past several of Victor's booby traps, including a tripwire connected to an improvised explosive device that Victor had constructed from mining equipment abandoned in the ruins. The explosion had been visible from miles away and had probably alerted everyone in the region that something significant was happening in the compound. Athena had proven to be more formidable than Victor had initially estimated. The team medic had also been their communications specialist, and she had managed to call for backup before Victor could prevent her from doing so. Her final message had been brief but effective. Ghost confirmed active. Primary team compromised. Request immediate air support and extraction. Victor had found her body clutching a satellite phone, and the device's display showed that her message had been received and acknowledged by whoever had sent the team. This meant that Victor's victory was only temporary. More hunters would be coming, probably with even better equipment and more extensive support. Valkyrie had been the last to fall, and her death had been the hardest for Victor to accomplish. The team leader had proven to be everything Victor had expected and more, demonstrating tactical skills that matched his own, and a level of determination that reminded him painfully of his dead brothers. In different circumstances, Victor thought she might have been someone he could have respected or even liked. Their final confrontation had taken place in the exact spot where Victor had killed Kozlov 7 years earlier, on the balcony that overlooked the compound's main plaza. It was there that Valkyrie had finally cornered Victor, using the same tactical principles that he had once used against his targets. But Victor had one last advantage that Valkyrie couldn't have known about. He had spent 7 years learning to live with guilt while she was still fighting for something she believed in. When the final moment came, Victor had been willing to sacrifice everything for victory, while Valkyrie had hesitated for just a fraction of a second because she still had something to lose. That fraction of a second had been enough. As Victor walked through the ruins, checking each of his fallen opponents to make sure they were truly dead, he reflected on the strange satisfaction he felt. For the first time since his brothers had died, Victor had been in a fair fight against worthy opponents. There had been no deception, no manipulation, no hidden agendas. Just professional soldiers doing their jobs and trying to survive. But satisfaction wasn't the same thing as victory, and Victor knew that his time was almost up. Athena's call for backup meant that more teams would be coming, probably with air support and heavy weapons that would make his defensive preparations irrelevant. Victor estimated that he had perhaps 6 hours before the next wave of hunters arrived, and this time, they wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating him. Victor used those 6 hours to complete his life's work. He retrieved the waterproof container that held his complete documentation of the conspiracy that had killed his brothers and destroyed the local population. To this collection, he added detailed written accounts of the hunting team's attack, including photographs he had taken during the battle and descriptions of their equipment and tactics. Future investigators would need to understand not just what had happened 7 years ago, but also how far powerful people were willing to go to keep their secrets buried. Most importantly, Victor added a complete confession of his own role in the events. He wrote about his decision to take Morrison's contract, his failure to adequately verify the intelligence he had been given, and his responsibility for the death of an innocent man whose only crime had been standing in the way of corporate profits. Victor also wrote letters to the families of his dead brothers, explaining what had really happened to their sons and husbands. These men had died believing they were heroes preventing a genocide, and their families deserved to know the truth about their sacrifice, even if that truth was painful. Finally, Victor wrote a letter to Elena Kozlov, the daughter of the man he had killed. In it, he provided her with the location of his evidence cache and the code she would need to access it. But more than that, he tried to explain why her father had died, and why Victor had spent 7 years of his life trying to make amends for an action that could never truly be forgiven. "Your father was a good man who died because I was a fool," Victor wrote in his careful handwriting. "I cannot give you back the life he should have lived, but I can give you the truth about why he died. Use it to finish the work he started, and perhaps some good can still come from all of this suffering." With his documentation complete, Victor prepared the cache for burial in a location that only Elena would be able to find. He had been leaving her clues for years through his anonymous tips, and the final clue would lead her directly to everything she needed to expose the conspiracy and bring justice to those responsible. As Victor finished his preparations, he heard the distant sound of helicopters approaching from the south. His estimate had been optimistic. The next wave of hunters was arriving ahead of schedule, but Victor was ready for them. He had used his remaining explosives to turn the entire compound into a massive booby trap. When his pursuers came looking for him this time, they would find more than they had bargained for. Victor didn't expect to survive the encounter, but he intended to make sure that the cost of silencing him would be higher than anyone had anticipated. Victor took up his final position in the same building where he had maintained his vigil for 7 years. From his window, he could see the entire compound spread out below him, and beyond that, the mining operation that had destroyed so many lives in service of corporate greed. The helicopters were clearly visible now, military aircraft carrying what appeared to be an entire platoon of soldiers. Someone had decided that subtlety was no longer necessary, and they were approaching the problem of Viktor Petrov with overwhelming force. Victor smiled as he checked his rifle one final time. He had always known that his story would end in these ruins, but he had never expected to feel so peaceful about it. His brothers' deaths had finally been avenged, not through revenge but through the simple act of ensuring that their sacrifice would be remembered and understood. The truth about what had happened here would survive even if Victor did not. As the first helicopter touched down in the plaza below, Victor whispered a final goodbye to the ghosts that had kept him company for 7 years. Then he settled into his shooting position and prepared to remind the world one last time why they had called him the Ghost. The final battle was brief, but spectacular. Victor's explosives turned the compound into a hellscape of fire and smoke, and his final shots found their marks with the same precision that had made him legendary among his brothers. When the smoke finally cleared and the rescue teams found his body, Victor was still gripping his rifle and still watching over the ruins he had called home. But Victor's real victory came 3 months later, when Elena Kozlov published a series of articles that exposed the entire conspiracy. Using Victor's documentation, she was able to prove that her father had been assassinated by foreign agents acting on behalf of corporate interests, and that the mining operation had been established through fraud and murder. The articles created an international scandal that led to criminal investigations, corporate prosecutions, and ultimately the restoration of the displaced population to their traditional homeland. The mining operation was shut down, the environmental damage was slowly repaired, and Kozlov's memory was honored with a memorial that acknowledged his sacrifice in the cause of justice. Elena never learned the name of the anonymous source who had provided her with the evidence that made her investigations possible. But every year on the anniversary of her father's death, she left flowers at the ruins of the compound where Viktor Petrov had maintained his 7-year vigil. The flowers were always gone by the next morning, scattered by the wind that swept constantly through the empty ruins. But Elena liked to think that somewhere the ghost of the man who had killed her father and then spent the rest of his life trying to make amends was finally at peace. In the end, Viktor Petrov had achieved something that few soldiers ever accomplish. He had transformed his greatest failure into his most meaningful victory. The last member of the Red Star Brotherhood had finally found redemption, not through forgetting his sins, but by ensuring that they would never be forgotten. The ruins still stand today, slowly being reclaimed by nature, as new growth pushes through the cracked concrete and twisted metal. Local people sometimes report seeing a figure watching from the high windows, but investigators never find anything more substantial than shadows and echoes. Perhaps Viktor Petrov is still there, maintaining his eternal vigil over the place where he learned the difference between being a soldier and being a hero. Or perhaps he has finally joined his brothers in whatever peace awaits those who die in service of the truth. Either way, the story of the man who became a legend by refusing to disappear has become part of the region's folklore, a reminder that some fights are worth fighting even when victory seems impossible, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for glory or recognition, but for the simple right to remember the truth.